researchers that are taking part here, because to me, because I don't have a central research topic with which to approach every single talk that's being given at this summer school, some theme that will allow me to sort all the different presentations in order that I want to attend them in order, and so on. They all look interesting to me. I'm like a little boy at a food court. Whereas most of you probably do have a central kernel interest in approaching things. What that means is that to me, a lot of the talks just seem like one damn thing after another. And I don't really have a general theme for organizing the different themes that speakers bring to it. So I want to start where I ended yesterday and try to create some continuity that way. I'll start with the Hamza, that is to say the 5 stable periods and the 6 gaps between the stable periods, the crises that we talked about yesterday. And while many of you are interested in early childhood, or maybe even infancy, or even birth, if you're going to have children of your own soon, that's sort of the thumb. I'm going to concentrate on the pinky. The last pinky is adolescence. And according to Vygotsky, the lines of development are things like concept formation, they're things like interests. And he's not very clear about the neoformations for the following reason, which is interesting for us. The Pedology of the Adolescent as a book, the concepts in it, are in a not perfectly mature form. We've kind of gone backwards in our series. We started with Foundations, which is essentially one of the last things that Vygotsky wrote. It's the most mature form of his thinking. Nikolai.
Sorry for interrupting you, David. So I think people should know that what David is speaking about is volume 3 of Vygotsky's pedagogical works, which we just finished the translation, and we have sent it to the publisher. And after review, this volume 3 of Vygotsky's pedagogical works, which is volume 1 of Pedology of Adolescent, will be published, we hope, this year. And we made a translation from the original Russian publication of this book, which was published in a very, very limited amount of copies as a manuscript, but printed manuscript in 1929 and 1931, which was never republished in Russian since, and was never translated into any of foreign languages. This is the first translation of this whole book, Pedology of Adolescent, to English. So this is what David is speaking about. Volume 3 in our series and volume 1, Pedology of Adolescent. Sorry, David, for interrupting you, but I think it's important.
Yes, and I hope we'll have it out. I hope we'll have actual copies out by the time we get a next summer school. The concepts that Vygotsky introduces in volume 1, and also the periods that Vygotsky, the ages and crises that are introduced in volume 2 of our series. When you get to volume 3, they are not in their mature form. We might even say that they're in an adolescent form, because although they're certainly there and they're full grown, they are not yet functioning in a whole system the way they are in volume 1 and volume 2. But we do have enough so that we can fill in the gaps with Pedology of the Adolescent. We can say something like concept formation is a central line of development for adolescents. And we can also say something about what the outcome of concept formation is going to be. And I'm going to concentrate on 3 concepts in particular. First of all, the concept of self, concept of personality. Second, the concept of profession, of the job you're going to do when you leave school. And then finally, and for the kids, most importantly, at least when they're adolescents, choice of partner, because those things are linked up with who you are and how much money you have, and so on, at least as far as the adolescent's concerned. So we're right here in the pinky finger of the Hamza that I introduced yesterday. And to recap some of what I'm going to say in terms of the questions that I raised yesterday, adolescence is a problem. It's a problem for Vygotsky, who is interested in constructing a science of a natural whole. And he's suddenly confronted with a period, which he calls the transitional period, which doesn't seem natural and it doesn't seem whole. And it's a problem for the ZPD as well, for the following reason. The zones of proximal development that he's been looking at previously link zones of development, like, early years and preschool and the crisis at 7, and the crisis at 7 in school age, and so on and so forth. Adolescence is a transitional period in two senses. It's a transition between two crises, crisis at 13, crisis at 17. And it's also a transition to something that is not a crisis, adulthood. So that's a problem too. How does Vygotsky see adolescence as not whole? Well, it's a perfect example of the thing that Nikolai goes on and on and on about, the construction of social functions on the basis of biological origins. And so there is a clash, as there always must be. The biological development is going on at a slightly different time from the sociocultural development. And as we'll see, that clash is getting worse and worse and worse, not better and better and better, for interesting reasons. What's the relationship between adolescence and pathogenesis? Hey, look at this picture. It's by a painter I didn't know before. He's a Swedish painter, Ernst Josefsson. Adolescence was a problem for Josefsson. He grew up, he developed syphilis, a sexual disease. He became a painter. So biological maturation, sexual maturation, and professional sociocultural maturation. But he also became a schizophrenic. He saw visions, he heard voices, and he painted crazy works like this one, which should give you goosebumps because that's the name. Guslisa in Swedish means goosebumps. And in this, he's expressing a certain non-coincidence, a non-identity. For the schizophrenic, it's the non-coincidence of reality and perception. You hear voices that aren't there. You see things that are not there. It's also a non-coincidence of the way people see you and the way you see yourself, a dissociation of concepts, especially the self and the other. And all of those, when I look at this painting, come through to me and it gives me goosebumps. And that's how Vygotsky describes adolescence, as a kind of a short-term schizothymic experience, not schizophrenia, because of course there's a difference between ontogenesis and pathogenesis, as we discussed yesterday. Pathogenesis ends by decreasing the ability of the body to act, to put it in Spinozian terms, whereas a crisis very often increases, and dramatically so, the ability of a body to act, to put it in Spinozian terms. So there's non-coincidence, and the non-coincidence is of 3 different kinds of maturation. First of all, the child's growing. Call that general anatomical maturation. Secondly, the child is getting interested in other bodies. That is sexual maturation. And then finally, there is sociocultural, professional maturation. These things are not one and the same, and they diverge more and more and more as puberty gets younger and younger, and as your first job, particularly here in South Korea, gets later and later and later. So now we've got adolescence going on well into the 20s. And it's in this sense, I think, that the question we talked about yesterday, do university students ever undergo zones of proximal development? Tragically, the answer may be yes, tragically, because employment is getting later and later and later. Okay, let me talk a little bit about, what Nikolai just talked about. That is to say, the book itself. It is a long distance course, literally, not figuratively. Of course, we are looking back at it from some 9 decades in its future, so we know how things turned out. But this was a correspondence course. It was a course written by Vygotsky for the #2 Pedagogical Institute in Moscow. And you had to pay 1 ruble of a 300 ruble salary for the course materials. You then had to mail in your homework, which could take many weeks. I took the Trans-Siberian, and even then it was 9 days from Khabarovsk to Moscow. And then you submit your homework by mail and you get it back with Vygotsky's comments, and I'm sure with criticisms. So what's in it? Well, in the first chapters, Vygotsky points out that previous attempts to explain and explore and even describe adolescence all seem to look on adolescence as a single mountain to be climbed, a single peak, a single summit of maturation. But they all disagree about where this mountain stands and how big it is and where you can find it and the way to the top. So for example, the biologizing pedologists like Blonsky, who I talked about yesterday, the tooth guy, the guy who believed that teeth are your means of production. Biologizing pedologists like Blonsky and Aryamov, who Vygotsky treats with great respect and great collegiality. And the most respectful and collegial thing that Vygotsky does to his colleagues and his respected friends is to criticize them ruthlessly, the way that Nikolai and I work together. These pedologists have treated adolescence as a biological maturation. We are apes, we are African apes, and we mature very much the same way that African apes do. And then there's the German school. Remember, Vygotsky's fluent in German, it's a mother tongue. Well, Yiddish is a mother tongue. Yiddish is sort of German written with funny letters. And Vygotsky reads a lot of German. He certainly reads Spranger and Freud. And the German romantics like Spranger and Freud have seen it as being either erotic, which is kind of pure love, or sexual, libido, maturation. And then finally, the anthropologists, and he's thinking of Levi-Brun, but also Turnwald, saw adolescence as being a kind of sociocultural maturation. Vygotsky stands back. He takes his distance, not quite as much distance as we're taking. It's the correspondence course is not quite as far flung as our summer school is, but Vygotsky stands back and takes in the whole range. And he sees adolescence as 3 different peaks. So chapters 1 through 4 are going to present the conceptual, methodological, and schematic introduction to adolescence, which he actually presents pretty well in volume 1 and volume 2 of our series. You'll see some interesting differences. Then 5 to 8 consider the first 2 peaks of the adolescent range, we can call it, the range of mountains that constitutes adolescence. The summit of general anatomical or organismic growth, which he sees in very heavily endocrine terms, and then sexual maturation. And by seeing it in terms of endocrinology, he's able to bring body and mind together in a very interesting way, but not in a purely biologizing way. The second volume, which is by far the biggest, by far the thickest, as you can imagine, is the 3rd peak. The 3rd peak is psychology on the one hand, and sociocultural maturation on the other. Nikolai and I were just talking a little bit about activity theory versus cultural historical theory. And he pointed out that chat, I'm sure he pointed this out in his workshop as well. He pointed out that that chat, by taking a certain look at sociocultural maturation per se on its own, is able to leave out a lot of the psychological dimensions. And we cannot do this with Vygotsky. For Vygotsky, they are 2 sides of the same mountain. You can't have the one without the other. So our second volume is going to present the third peak, the psychology of the adolescent, interests and concept formation. Concept formation is really long. You think you've read it because you think you've read chapter 5 of Thinking and Speech. You haven't. Chapter 5 of Thinking and Speech is half of chapter 10 in Pedology of the Adolescent. It is long. It's by far the longest thing Vygotsky ever wrote. It's also, I should say, one of the most moving things that Vygotsky ever wrote, because his dearly beloved PhD student, one of his first cheja, as we say here in Korean, the disciple, Sakharov, is working on him with concept formation. They develop a well-known body of work, which you will be familiar with. And then he kills himself. He commits suicide. And Vygotsky is absolutely stunned and cannot touch the empirical work for years, and then writes to Sakharov's widow and says, would you like to spend the summer with me and with my family, going over Sakharov's notes? And this is the result. This is what he wrote in memory of his dearly beloved student, Leonid Sakharov. That is the treasure to come. Before we get there, we need to talk about sex, not just the discovery of biological sex, but what I'm going to call the invention of love, the invention of love, which Nikolai and I disagree on this, but I will hold is a higher psychological function.
Yeah, I agree completely today.
Okay, good. That makes things easier. There's a lot to disagree about. And so I think what we need to do is to break up and break out. And I'd like everybody to begin by choosing, once again, youngest is the spokesman. This isn't my idea. This is Suxiang's idea. She thinks the youngest is has the sharpest elbows and also the quietest voice. And so we want to change that around, get the youngest person to have a sharp voice and soft elbows. And choose your youngest as your spokesperson and consider all three of the following questions. Okay, you got 15 minutes for this. Question number 1, is it a thing? I mean, is it a thing? Is it one thing? Is it one thing or is it two things? Is it one process or is it two processes? And if it's one process, is it a crisis or a stable period? Second thing, this is question B, is adolescence necessary? Because, I mean, this seems like a stupid question, but in Vygotsky's time, there was and still, if you read Karpov's book, The Neo-Vygotskyan Approach to Child Development, it says,
sorry, I have to switch off my microphone.
Okay. If you read, if you read Leontiev, for those of you who are interested in activity theory, he does in Problems of the Development of Mind, he does say that actually adolescence is not necessary, that the crisis is brought on by capitalist society. Karpov says, nah, it's not capitalist society. Actually, capitalist society is pretty good for adolescents. The problem is strict teenage parents of teenagers who are putting too many strictures on their kids and so on. So it's a real question. And if you don't, if you don't believe Leontiev and Karpov, look at this wonderful book by Margaret Mead called Coming of Age in Samoa that just founded modern anthropology. Essentially what she's arguing is that in Samoa, they don't do adolescence. They go straight into sexual maturation. And because it's all so natural, there isn't any crisis. So is adolescence necessary? It's not a stupid question. It's worth discussing. And the third one, a very practical one, because I think John is right when he says, in the end, the problem is not simply to study the world, it's to change it. I think you can't really study the world without wanting to change it. And you can't really understand the world without trying to change it, at least trying. So what do you think about sex education? Should we teach it as health? Should we teach it as ethics? That is sex best explained as a natural science? Or is it best explained as human culture? Is it an Enlightenment 18th century classical technology? Or is it, Foucault believed this, the technology? Or is it more like what the Romantics said, sort of an interest, a form of imagination, and an art? Those three questions, everybody. Let's break up for 15 minutes and then get back together, and we'll hear what you have to say, what you had to say. Okay? We ready? Okay, good.
John, would you please go to room 4? Can you choose to go to room 4, John? Because I cannot see your name. Okay. Nikolai, did you receive the invitation? No? I could see you are in room.
No, I did, but let me please not go to any room by now.
Ah, okay.
Can I stay here in the main room? Thank you, because I'm a little bit tired.
Oh, okay. So maybe what I'm okay, I can go to room 3. Judy. That's all right. Hi, Juliet. What I can do is
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
What happened?
We went back to the main, we're in the main room now.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're back in the main room. In our group we had some very interesting discussions. So maybe now each of the group can we can take turns. So group one, who's the youngest in group one? Would you like to report what's your discussion?
Yeah, in our group, only Zixi and I were in the group, so Zixi is younger than me. She's going to present.
Yeah, sure. So in our group, we actually discussed 3 questions, but we have the most discussion in the third one, which is the sex education. So we both think sex education should be tackled for both health and ethical side, because for the health side, I think it's more related to the biological perspective about the body maturation, and because in the adolescent time, the body transformation is definitely different from the early childhood period. So that is important to be taught the difference. And but also it's important for the ethics part, because we think the distinguishment between the animals and human beings is about ethics, is about the respectful relationship, and how do we interact with each other, and how do we respect each other at the same time, because we're in a society and we are dealing with people constantly. And so we think the sex education definitely have to be taught in both health and ethics way. And at the same time, they said, is sex best explained as a natural science or as human culture? So we think it's also birth is from birth natural science and human culture. And we think the way as just like Piaget and Vygotsky, yeah, like I think, yeah, it's not just one side or the other. So natural science definitely, from the biological perspective, they probably think about the body maturation in a different way. They probably interpret it as, okay, by a certain age and one part of your body will look different or something like that. But in the human culture, they will probably teach what's the best practice and how do we be respectful to each other. And the last point is, as enlightenment technology or as romantic art. To be honest, we're not really sure what is meant by enlightenment technology, but we think, yeah, maybe it's part of romantic art in a sense, because I remember there's some kind of Roma architecture, and they have those romantic arts, and they have the appreciation about the human body. So we do think it's maybe part of the romantic art, but we're not sure about the enlightenment technology, and hope that can be answered. Thank you.
Thank you. David, would you like to give the response now, or you will wait till everyone finish their sharing?
Well, I just want to completely agree that one of the key concepts we need to teach adolescents is consent. Consent. That's what the Me Too movement is all about. It's about what constitutes consent and what constitutes no, the meaning of no. And of course, there's a biological side to that. Avoiding pain, not avoiding paint, sorry, avoiding pain. But there's a technological side as well, contraception. Nevertheless, I still think that you're absolutely right. There's no teaching consent without teaching ethics. Ethics, which we only here in Korea is ethics, a mandatory subject from preschool right through university. I teach ethics, believe it or not. That's one of the courses I have to teach every semester. And it's one of my favorite courses, thanks to Vygotsky. Sorry.
I mean, we have some empirical data on this. We've taught biologically for quite a long time in terms of mechanics, almost completely unsuccessfully in terms of things like unwanted pregnancies or venereal diseases or things like that. So and we haven't taught ethics, certainly in Australia, very well, or with any kind of systematic way of doing it. So perhaps it could be argued that we don't need the biological. I mean, one always wants to say what you need both sides of it, but we've certainly taught one side and not succeeded. So we haven't tried the other way. Is there an empirical element to this theoretical problem?
See, I disagree with that, John, because I worked in the Catholic sector for 30 years, and there's an ethical aspect of that because it's related to the religious doctrine. And so sex education was related to the institution in which or the institution as far as the Catholic sector, the archdiocese, as far as it was related to, and the education program came out of scripture as such, as far as following doctrine. So I would disagree depending on the sectors in which you're working in. If you were working in, and we're having in Australia at the present moment very big discussions about religious freedoms, and anyway, so but I would say that it's sex education is very much dependent upon the sector in which you're working in and how it's been interpreted and then how it rolls out. So I think that when we were having a discussion, Tara and I, it was very much about not as a binary, whether it be biological or ethics. It's not a binary, it needs to be intertwined. And then it's very much dependent upon the institutions that you are working in or you are involved with. So for instance, in a diverse setting such as a school in Melbourne Metropolitan in the Western area, you have a diverse community, and so therefore you might have within your classroom children that are of a Muslim faith, children that are of a Christian faith, and so therefore it's very much dependent upon what the families want as far as their children, and that the families have a very big say about the education of their children as far as sex education is concerned. So I think that there's very much the different levels, the societal. If we're looking at the societal, there's also the aspect of the online proliferation of pornography and the impact that has on young children and their views of sex, and sexual relationships. And so there's, and as well as the Me Too, which we talked about, the gender aspect. So there's a lot going on just in sex education. Ethics has to be involved with, as well as the biological, because of the different aspects of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we talked about anyway.
Suxiang?
That's wonderful. Anyone else would like to add a comment? If not, we're going to move to room 2. So we have Catherine and Ishraq. So Ishraq, are you ready to share?
Yeah, we have been discussing the first question only. We haven't gone to the second one. Sorry for that. But we have been sharing the idea of how this kind of idea of adolescence is limited and make a boundary on the let's say the how we treat this teenager, if I want to call teenager. And I said to David and Catherine that I don't like this also, because in that time and that age, this teenager or it has a lot of potential, it has a lot of capability, and in a lot of putting a lot of limitation to this age is not really showing their potential. And then we move to how school, Sosian, if you want to add here as well, how school is really kept us limited as well in what we're going to expose to. And all these years from grade 1 to 12, and then suddenly in university that we discover, no, we have to find ourselves, we have to discuss more other issues in our life. Then we jump to the idea of neoliberalism, when those kind of institutions can divide this kind of skills in terms of, oh, now we're going to give you a whole, let's say, a class on problem solving, and not really link it with the subject that we want to learn. And that also it's adding another layer of let's say, what is the word, is like separating the subject from the skills that we want. So now, for example, I'm doing academic literacy skills to the higher education, especially for first year. And what they do, they give them that English classes and they give them the subject class. But then when the skills will be embedded, they will say, we will give you another let's say, subject, which that will take our time, take our energy, take a lot of our like potential to just keep studying without really implementing in the end and use our potential. So yeah, do you want to add anything, Soshian and Catherine?
Yeah, just Susan said, and I agree, that when you are a young person, you're asking yourself, why am I living? Yeah, you're asking yourself these existential questions, and I think that probably links in with Vygotsky's your concept of self. But increasingly now, this neoliberalism is pushing all people towards science and killing the humanities, and it's invading everywhere. And I kind of feel that this, the potential of adolescence, maybe if there is a crisis, maybe it's because this neoliberal, in our world anyway, system is pushing down. And so this agrees with you, Eshraq, like tamping down their potential and keeping them in a kind of holding pen, I feel, and kind of directing their lives towards sciences and economics. And those things by themselves can be frightening, and because ethics come a big second behind inventing things and marketing things. So that's just, yeah, why am I living is a question I think that adolescents ask themselves really seriously. So yeah, and I don't know if society helps them find answers. That's my comment.
Thank you. David, do you have any comments?
Can I disagree respectfully and gently with something Eshraq said in our group? She questioned the whole notion of adolescence. Now, I actually spent 2 years of my adolescence in the Middle East, first in Egypt and then Sudan, and then in Syria. And I was really impressed because I spent it around guys, around men. And, you know, in every country I lived in, there was a room where the women slept and there was a room where the men slept, and then the men were out on the street all day. And so you spend all your time with blokes. It's a very blokey life. And I'm impressed at how much we talked about sex and how much of the literature we read was about sex. How much of it was, I mean, it was good literature. It was things like Tahab and Junoon and Muhammad Deeb, you know, this wonderful explosion of brilliant Arabic literature, which was mostly about sex. I mean, it did raise all the existential questions that Catherine's talking about. You know, why are we here? And what is life? And so on and so forth. But a lot of it was about what teenagers think about all over the world, which is this central interest. Now, this is a really good example of what Vygotsky means when he's talking about a central line of development. The central line of development, which is the central interest of the kids at that particular age. And I think a system of education that somehow ignores the central interest that all the children have for the whole period of their lives is deeply wrong. However, Vygotsky has some interesting ideas about how we should teach sex education. And the first one, which I'm just going to give to you right now, is don't call it that. Don't call it that. And don't have a separate sex education class at all.
Okay, thank you, David. And maybe we can move on to room 3. Sharon, you already, I think you already mentioned you share some of your discussions. Would you like to add something else? All good? Okay. So how about room 4? We got Jenny Nushin.
I think I'm presenting for room 4. We started discussing what adolescence was, and whether it was one things, two things, the biological, social, psychosocial, language, ethics. It was like trying to juggle a very slippery octopus. There were pieces that would leap out all over the place, and that it wasn't all developing at the same rate, as had been mentioned earlier. And then the discussion moved to the to successfully get a job. The age was increasing, but the decreasing age of the puberty and the divergence of those two, which was brought up as well. Does this change the focus of the adolescents in focusing towards a job? Is that part of their identity? Still, when does it become part of their identity? Does it become later? Whether vocation comes into that at all. And I learned that you needed a passport to go from the country to the city in Russia in Vygotsky's time. I didn't know that. And so from Vygotsky's time to now, there is a much, the mind shift has changed a lot in the ability to be able to see what is potential and what is ideal and what people can strive towards. And so how does that fit in with adolescence and moving towards what you can become? I think that covers most of those, well, some of our points anyway. Do any of the others want to add to that?
So, Machine, you were also in the room. Do you want to add anything? If not, David, would you like to respond, or? You unmute. You need to unmute yourself. You are still okay, you're still muted. Oops.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, now I think what I want to do is to give my own answers on the basis of Vygotsky. And this isn't just the pedology of the adolescent, it's also some work we've been doing here in South Korea on Vygotsky's wonderful, wonderful book on the emotions, which we've turned into 2 volumes. It's a long discussion of Descartes, Spinoza, holism, and how emotions start with sensations and end with some of the highest interests and even concepts that human beings can formulate. End is the wrong word here. They don't really end. They animate, they enliven, they bring to life the higher concepts that we have. And there doesn't seem to be a breaking point. There doesn't seem to be a point where you can say, this is where health ends and this is where ethics begins. And that's all in this wonderful work on the emotions. And one of the, Vygotsky tends to be quite negative. He tends to get something that bothers him and just chew at it a lot. And what bothers him in the emotions, and also through much of the pedology of the adolescent, is dualism. It's the idea that we teach sex as health on the one hand or ethics on the other. And it doesn't do to say, well, let's build a bridge between them. I tried this, by the way. I had a biology lesson that I had to teach about reproduction, specifically about conception. And I decided I was going to teach it because I'm interested in the problem of pain. Why does the adolescent's first experience of sex, why is it so painful? Why does it hurt so much? And what can you do about that? And so what I tried to do is to teach kids how to artificially inseminate cows, which is quite complicated. You have to pull the tail up, reach inside the anus where the cow shit comes out, and then grab the cervix of the womb and then stick the tool in order to inseminate the cow. And many farmers get hurt because the cow will kick them during this and really hurt them. And so I thought this would be a really good way to teach something about the pain without actually mentioning the problem, without mentioning the problem. And you can also say things about anal sex and how dangerous it is and how it spreads AIDS. And you can do all kinds of things while you're doing this. I even learned, for example, during my colonoscopy, you get to see all the blood vessels inside the intestines, which is really interesting from an AIDS prevention point of view. So all this was terribly interesting, and I learned an awful lot. But I also found that the kids were not able to, Janine Sprue is shaking her head and thinking, what a silly lesson. And she's right. But, what can I say? I'm an old man. I don't know these things. So it didn't work very well.
I understand the enthusiasm, but I can also imagine the students' faces.
Oh no! A lot of them were farming kids, and they were farming kids, and they knew what I was talking about. And one of them, their father had been badly hurt doing this, and told some interesting stories about it. So that part wasn't a problem. The problem was getting them to realize that I'm really talking about human beings, because dualism is so fixed in our minds that what is true of cows can never be true of human beings, and that's the problem: dualism. And it's a problem for Vygotsky too. So one of the things he does is talk a lot about Descartes. So here's Descartes. He's in his 50s. He's an old man. He's not married, although he's had a child by one of his servants. And he's approached by one of the most eligible young ladies in all of Europe, Queen Christina of Sweden, whose father has just died. And so she's queen, died in the wars of religion, Gustavus Adolphus. And she writes to Descartes and says, "Dear Professor Descartes, you are the most renowned scientist in the whole of Europe. I need to know something about the question of love. This is because I have never felt this passion in my soul, and I am now required to marry and give children to the Swedish crown." And they have a very interesting correspondence back and forth, and eventually Descartes is invited to Sweden to establish the Swedish Academy of Sciences, where he promptly dies because it's too cold there. But before he does, he also has a correspondence with the Princess Elizabeth. And all of this is in Vygotsky, by the way. And the subject of the correspondence with the Princess Elizabeth is, how does the soul move the body? And how is the body felt by the soul? And here's Descartes' answer. Well, there are two main kinds of thoughts: actions of the soul and passions of the soul, activity and sensation. The ones I call actions are all of our volitions, acts of the will, because we experience them as coming directly from our soul, with no input from anything else. On the other hand, our various perceptions or items of knowledge can be called the soul's passions, taking this word in a very general sense, because they're not actively made by our soul, but rather passively received by the soul from the very things that they represent. Well, Queen Christina was not convinced. She, as soon as Descartes had died, she abdicated and she went to Europe, spent most of her time in Rome, and by the way, fell in love with women. And that's why she's dressed as a man in this painting. Elizabeth went to a Catholic school and went into a convent where she became a lifelong opponent of mind-body dualism and also a great patron of the arts. And I'm going to suggest that Vygotsky follows Elizabeth. Vygotsky supports Elizabeth, not Descartes. And of course, because this is a philosophical question, he brings in Spinoza. And we have talked quite a bit about how Marx influences Vygotsky, but there is another great man in Vygotsky's life. Someone Vygotsky read from the time he was a teenager, and after his bar mitzvah, his father gave him a copy of Spinoza to just a few weeks before he died. And that was Spinoza's Ethics, one book. And it is the most thoroughly monist book ever written. It is the main message of every single chapter is one. God and nature are one. body and mind are one. Passions and actions are one. Freedom and slavery can be made into some kind of a unity. All of those chapters in Spinoza are essentially so many arguments for transdisciplinarity, not building bridges between ethics and health, but seeing that you can have a form of ethics that includes the whole of human life, including the biological side of it. And that's the transdisciplinary approach that I think we need to develop. Nobody talked very much about, is adolescence necessary, except Ishraq. And this is one of the reasons why I liked Ishraq's comments so much. Ishraq was implying that adolescence is not necessary. And of course, as we saw, this is Leontiev's position. This is certainly Karpov's position, that adolescence is a nasty bit of drama that we can do away with. I think Vygotsky's answer, and certainly my answer, is that adolescence is necessary. It is historically necessary. It was invented. In fact, it is being invented. And in an important sense, it is an unfinished project today. Now, this is exciting for us as cultural historical researchers. The invention of childhood really happened in the past. I know Philip Arias would like to convince you that it's still very recent, but I'm going to suggest that it happened a long time ago. Adolescence is still a work in progress, and we can study it right now. Anybody who's doing a PhD on middle school or high school has the chance to be a witness to an important stage in the invention of adolescence. And the invention of adolescence is the invention of love. An analogy with childhood is instructive here, because many of us are working in early childhood. So in most mammals, the correlation coefficient for the relationship between the end of lactation nursing and the eruption of the first molars in your mouth, roughly 0.9, 90% overlap. Mammals stop drinking and start chewing at roughly the same time, fortunately for mothers. But not chimps and not humans, but for different reasons in different directions. So the chimps wean their young very late, about 1.7 years after the teeth arrive. And humans are the opposite. So as far as we know, human hunter-gatherers wean about 3.4 years before the teeth arrive. And as we know a lot about this, because if we can analyze the barium deposits that are laid down during nursing in the fossilized remains of Neanderthal children, and we find that Neanderthals had childhood. And there's a big discussion about whether Neanderthals had music and whether they had speech. I don't know if they had music. I don't know if they had speech, but I know this, they had childhood. And what that means is that they had somehow learned that if you wean the child early, mommy can go back to work early and produce food. And the child can learn to eat adult food, get a head start on adult food, and get a head start on producing adult food. And then mommy can either have more children, if mommy is well off, or just help sustain the health of the child that has already been born. What a great invention. By inventing childhood, our ancestors invented us. Now, what about inventing adolescence? What about inventing a time? See, childhood is partly about the time between the period when the child is biologically dependent, cannot replace the food that the child is consuming, and the moment when the child can hunt and gather on his or her own. Adolescence is about inventing a period between the time we are able to replace not our food, but our bodies, and the time that we are able to form a real self-concept, choose a personality, choose a profession, and choose a partner, because from such children come more children. With childhood, we got to guess all this. The barium deposits data is good, the historical records are good, and there are some hunter-gatherer societies that still survive, the Sami and also the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. But it's guesswork. With adolescence, not so. With adolescence, well, we can study chimps. Chimps wean around age 5, as we said, and they tend to menstruate and start having children at age 7. So there's this big gap. here in Seoul, children are weaned at about 11 months. That's pretty standard. And the girls don't menstruate until 12, and boys generally start to ejaculate slightly after that. So there's a big gap. And Vygotsky suggests this gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, that adolescence is getting larger and larger and larger. And that's good. Adolescence is good. Adolescence is a major, just as childhood was a major invention, adolescence is a major invention. So what that means is that Vygotsky rejects the naturalistic view, the romantic view, the Rousseauian view, that there should be some uncritical passage from childhood to adulthood. He also rejects the evolutionary view, that evolution is always for the best, because he says that actually adolescence and childhood are in some ways non-adaptive, unless you look at them from a cultural historical perspective. Then you see these are extremely wise moves that our ancestors made for the construction of culture. The more we can postpone reproduction, the more we can ensure the survival and health of our offspring. So adolescence was not biologically necessary for animals, but it's historically necessary for us. And it represents a major step forward in human history. And the last question, which provides a better model for sex education? Technology or art? Rationality or romanticism? The 18th century with its enlightenment, or the 19th century with its flights of imagination and fantasy? Of course you know the answer. You came up with it in groups. We need both, and we need more. It's a kind of premonition of the rising stars, the constellation of ideas that Vygotsky will later develop into the ZPD, that Vygotsky takes from Spranger, who's a really nasty Nazi psychologist, a very, very idealist, sort of in the German romantic way. He takes the idea that when we teach adolescents, we orient to the next and not to the actual zone of development. When we teach adolescents, we teach them about marriage and about starting a family. We don't just teach them about how to get laid. Spranger is mute on the key question of how long we can ask the adolescents to abstain from sexual behavior. How long can the child wait? How long can you say, love must wait? And this is also a big question for Vygotsky and Zalkind, and I'm going to suggest that it's a big question today and that none of us have answered it. But Vygotsky agrees with Zalkind's three basic principles of sex education. Principle one, no sex education. That is to say, no separate sex education class. It's too embarrassing. The kids don't like it. The teachers don't like it. That was true then. It's even more true now. Number two, no classes without sex education. Now, only in Vygotsky do you see two negatives that totally contradict each other in this way. But what he means, of course, is sex across the curriculum. In other words, not sex as a separate class. That's too easy. Not even sex as kind of building bridges between, inseminating cows and biology and that sort of thing. But sex as a way of organizing the whole syllabus. Because after all, the most important lesson you have to teach is how can you be comfortable with people who are getting interesting to you in a bodily as well as a mental way. That's the key question we have to teach. And so even in things like math, setting up group work, making sure, for example, that our girl students are as well represented in the top students as the boy students are. This is a big problem in Korea, maybe not such a big problem elsewhere. But all of this has to be done across the curriculum. And then finally, and this is the most controversial thing, I remember when I first presented this idea in Australia, people didn't like it very much. All components should involve positive sublimation. How do you take sexual interests and divert them, mediate them into other ends, especially art and science? When I first presented this as a way of teaching the kids that no means no, I was considered to be a terrible party pooper and a killjoy. And I understand that. I understand that because I too am a Westerner. Anyway, I was born a Westerner. I'm not really like that anymore. But I do want to suggest that in some ways it's this third idea, sublimation, positive sublimation, that is most important. Let me present it in the following way. Sexual interest between men and women, or between men and women and women, any kind of sexual interest is most effective when it's most mediated, when it's most indirect, when it's less obvious, creepy, and more coy and funny. That is a hard thing to learn, but it's true. And the kids are going to master that, whether we like it or not. But teachers should be there to help. How do you teach kids to express their interest in each other in a slightly less threatening, less menacing, more mediated, and more indirect way? Now, I'm getting a little far from the book, and I don't want you to lose interest in this book because I think it's fascinating. It's a wonderful book. And it's not just, like all Vygotsky, it's not just a historical artifact. It's a serious book, and it will help you. It'll help you do research. And if you're a teacher, it'll help you teach. But he was a really, really difficult professor. I know, because I tried doing his homework and I submitted it to an article for Mind, Culture, and Activity. It was just accepted. You can read it. And I'll present the findings of it if we have time in this session. But the main thing I want to do is to break out again into groups and look at this homework. Look at these 4 assignments that came with Chapter 7. This is the psychology of sexual maturation. And these are the 4 assignments that you have to write out and send back to Vygotsky in Moscow and get his comments and criticism on. Now, I'm not going to ask you to do the assignments before you come back. That would take too long. But I do want you to choose one and discuss how feasible it is, and then come back and be ready to say something about how you do it. Now, Suxiang, are you there?
Yes.
Can you make sure that every group has this homework assignment? I'm not exactly sure how to do that. Okay, I can do that. I just put it in. I already
put it in the chat.
Super, thank you. Let's break out.
Okay. So do you think 5 minutes? Maybe we can have 5 minutes and then we can come back for some discussions.
Okay, you're the timekeeper, so you handle that. Yep.
Xiang, which room do you want me in?
I think maybe room 2.
Okay.
Nicola, I'm going to give you some break time again. Okay, maybe we can share. So room 1, I was in room 1 and we were talking about, I know they were too shy to talk about this, so I'm going to talk about that. So we were picking number 3 question, and then we were saying when we were younger, all the 4 of us in our school, in our education, we don't actually talk about this topic. We just try to avoid it. Probably, most of us just heard about the mentioning of sex in biology or religious class. And especially in biology class, we were just making fun of each other, like, oh, we don't want to talk about that. But we do notice there is an advancement in the education, because back in China, we don't talk about this throughout, like from my childhood to university, we don't mention about this. We try to avoid the concept. But now when I'm teaching in Australia, we actually spend time to talk with young children about like, oh, we have the body boundary and this is my private parts and you have to stop. I don't want you to touch me or things like that. So we think like there is advancement in society in regards to sex education. And that's the main point from our group. So room 2, Sharon and Tara and John, would you like to share what you have discussed?
So for second time running, I was the youngest in the room, which is an unusual event for me. So thank you very much, Susan. We talked about number 3, and we did say that would be a way to go as far as allowing the opportunity for young people to discuss sex education. I think that's right, was coming from them, and giving them the opportunity to look at what was going on in their school settings. And then we then had a conversation about young people today and the aspect of gender fluidity and identity. So we had a discussion around that, which was, yeah, so that's the 2 things. If someone would like to chime in. Yep, okay, so that's what we discussed.
Thank you. And room 3, we have Hongzhi, Janae, and Zixi.
Okay, I will. Thank you. Yeah, we choose question 4. Yeah, our group chose question 4. Like yeah, I shared with my group member. I didn't really. I don't think when I was a high school student, there was no sex education in the curriculum in China. It was part of the biology subject, and as most teacher for that chapter, teachers feel embarrassed to teach. They will ask the students to read it by yourself after class. Yeah, I had a good teacher. He tried to make it in a way like a respectful and open to both teachers and the students. But still, I don't remember. But there was no chapter about like a sexual relationship. It's more like a body parts, like a change of your body when you're adolescents. Then like with it, but I think it's a problem it's a gap also in the curriculum. It will affect like the whole generation or more than one generation, because like people were joking that for that generation, they learn about sex from watching pornographic video rather than from formal educational channel. But like David also joined us. Actually, when students have to seek for information from watching pornographic video, they miss the important part of consent. Yeah, and how to say no, how to build a respectful relationship. because without the educational part and also guidance, I think they only pay attention to the action of having sex. Yeah, that's anyone want to, yeah. From our group, feel free to jump in.
Well done.
Thank you.
So thank you, David. Would you like to make any comments? You mute yourself again.
Thanks, Suxian. I want to cast a little cold water on the idea that we have made big advances. First, there's the thing that Hongzhi just pointed out, that although we laugh at Bollywood movies when they fade to black instead of having kissing on the screen, and we laugh at the movies from the 50s and the 60s where you weren't allowed to have, if you show two people sitting on a bed, they have to have their feet on the floor, that sort of thing. But actually, in some ways, leaving out the moment of negotiating consent is far worse, because that's the key concept we need as educators. The mechanics, the kids will find out eventually, but you need to talk about thus far and no further. I'll do this, but I won't do that. I'm not into sadism and bondage and or I am into it or whatever. That part is getting entirely left out, because when you look at pornography, they get right down to business, and there's very, very little language involved. Just as we have to have language across the curriculum, we need to have consent, free will across the curriculum. Why? Well, because arguably adolescence is the moment when free will, in the meaningful sense of it, is formed. And that's not just sexual maturation. That's also choice of profession. It's also choice of personality. These are the moments where freedom really counts. And this is also teaching free choice is one of the most difficult moments in education, because as soon as you teach by decreasing the degrees of freedom, giving kids menus and choices rather than letting them come up with their own. And all of this makes this one of the most difficult and most important parts of the curriculum. Okay, Suxian, have we got another group?
Oh no, we only have 3 groups for this breakout room.
And have we got time?
I think we are running out, like we already finished. We ran out of time. Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to prove to you that we have made no progress. So the big criticism is that Hongzhi made is that professors all say, go read it after class. And I'm going to do exactly that. I have written a paper that will appear in Mind, Culture, and Activity, where I do all 4 questions of Vygotsky's homework, and I try to show you how you can do a linguistic analysis of real teenagers having discussions about real sex that happened in the 14th century in Italy, but never mind, with their mother and their teacher present, and that by analyzing this, you can show important psychological moments of difference between this sexual maturation of boys and girls in South Korea. And if anybody else is interested in this question, show me your data. We need data on this, everybody. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much for a small and really productive session.